Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Okay, can I welcome everybody to this Fringe meeting? My name's John McDonnell. I'm the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington. Thanks for coming along. This is part of the World Transformed series of sessions over this month. And it is on behalf as well of an initiative we launched a couple of months ago called Claim the Future. And it's about claiming the future, about discussing what sort of society do we want. I'll come on to that in a minute, but let me just take you through some of the basics of the instructions that I need to just let people know. Okay. I just want to go through, I'm sorry if I'm bumbling over this, but let's just go through it. First of all, to make the session more accessible, we'll be using a live transcription service called Otter. Attendees using Otter will have to follow a link and open the transcript as a separate window. The link will be shared in the chat box by one of our tech volunteers. And if you're having difficulties, message the tech volunteer on the chat. Okay. And again, kind of thank Nikki, who's doing the signage at the moment, and her colleague will be on shortly as well. But also thank all the tech volunteers. It's wonderful. Secondly, look, let me just say on behalf of the World Transformed, it relies on your support to continue to grow. And it's the great work that they're doing. It's around political education, engaging people in the debate. And it's I just think it's a breathtakingly fresh initiative that has been going on the last couple of years. And it's really involved people. I can't express my admiration for the work they've done enough, really. Let me just say, so far they've told me 94 people have signed up to the supporters network just since the beginning of this festival, but they need 16 more monthly supporters to reach their target and sustain their year-round political education projects and run the next festival. So if you're able to spare a small monthly donation, please consider supporting it, and you'll see it. You'll see on the chat, we'll put up how you can do that, basically. Okay. Just go to the World Transform and as set out on the chat, and you'll be able to sign up. Please do, because we want to keep the World Transform work going all year now, not just at party conference. And lastly, let me just go through a few chat principles. Let me get this right. We want everyone to feel welcome in these spaces and for everyone's voices to be heard. So please bear in mind that when engaging in the chat, please don't use inappropriate, rude, or unkind language, and please don't spam. Participants who stray from these principles may be prevented from further posting in the chat and comment box, but hopefully this won't happen. I don't think it will in this discussion. But if you do have a question or a comment for one of our speakers, please do fire away, and we'll try and include them in the Q&A at the end. But also actually on some of those, if we can't include them, I'll take those away, and with the other participants in the discussions today, we'll get back to you, okay? Because we want to make sure people are fully involved. So let's now just go straight to the session, shall we? Let me just quickly go through the background of this in terms of the World Transform. I was speaking at an event last night, Progressive International, and I started off by saying, look, it's been a startling last 10 months. It has been, loss of the election was, a hell of a blow. But then straight into the pandemic, and there's been some real tragedies as a result of that. And now we're on the edge of a recession. And of course, we've got the overhanging all the time is the threat of climate change. And actually what that's done, and it's interesting really, is that the problems of the pandemic in particular were so serious that actually it generated, I think it brought out the best in many people, absolute selfless acts of mutual support and solidarity, but also it actually people started questioning the society that we live in, the economic arrangements of our society, and recognized, I think, it was almost like a pressure test on our economy and our society, the weaknesses and the failures, just how much our well, neoliberal capitalist system has failed us. Austerity, ill-preparing our NHS or social care to deal with the pandemic, the precarious nature of so many people's lives in terms of the work that they do, the income that they have, and the real poverty many experience, and also the grotesque levels of inequality within our society. But what's the good that's come out of this is, first of all, I think a real willingness, if not a demand for change, but also ideas for radical change. And Claim the Future's purpose was to say, look, there's all these ideas coming forward. There's really good discussions going on. Policy experts, think tanks, all, I think, emanating some brilliant ideas about the sort of society that we want. And alongside that, you've got others who are really just hard campaigning. The renters union, ACORN, campaigning to stop evictions. The trade unions now that are campaigning to protect jobs, Unite battling with BA to protect jobs. The Tate strikers, the PCS are out on strike today demonstrating. All of those trade union campaigns to protect jobs, but also demanding a sort of economy that we need for the future, to give people a decent wage levels, decent conditions of work, and a say at work as well. But also the whole range of other groups, the Women's Budget Group, the Socialist Health Association, We Own It, all campaigning now for proper social care, national care service. And of course, the magnificent Black Lives Matter movement, which has brought to everyone's attention now the grotesque levels of racial inequality and injustice. I just want to pay tribute to them. And yes, Extinction Rebellion and all the other environmental campaigns that are reminding us that overhanging it all is the threat of climate change. Now, claim the future. The idea was actually to let us claim the future now. Let us bring together those ideas and those campaigns so that when we're campaigning, all our ideas are really thoroughly worked out, that we have the alternative, that we can convince people, and that actually we can create a climate of opinion so that no matter who's the leader of the Labour Party, no matter who is representing us, actually recognizes this is the way forward, this is the sort of society that we have to create, but also here's the program of policies that actually we need to create that new society. And what's interesting, the 2017 manifesto, the 2019 manifesto of the Labour Party, they were terrific. They were great. They laid the foundations of socialist discussion for the future. What sort of society do we need? What sort of socialism do we want? But actually, the pandemic and the threat of climate change means we need more radical solutions, more radical than 2017-19 manifestos. And that's what's coming out of our discussions around Claim the Future. We've been hosting a whole range of Zoom meetings, discussions, working groups. We've been publishing some papers, and we've got a website as well. And the idea is just bringing those thinkers and those campaigners together. And I just think the creativity that we have in our movement now is absolutely staggering. But also, I tell you what's made me so much more optimistic as well is, well, the new intake in Parliament, the new members of the Socialist Campaign Group. We've got a new generation that's come forward, and they inspire me. They've given me such hope for the future in terms of not just the Labour Party, but the way in which we can develop socialist practice within our society. And so what we thought we'd do on this fringe is bring a few of them together, because they're working on different aspects of the sort of policies that we need and the campaigning that we need to develop a new and socialist society that will tackle climate change, give us the future, and make sure that we create a society based on social justice and equality. So I want to introduce a few of them now. Our first speaker is Apsana. Apsana, you'll know many of you because she came into Parliament at the last general election and just immediately made her mark. Her ability to argue the case, both in Parliament, in terms of what local constituency and her community needs, has been second to none. I think she's made incredible impression within the House of Commons, but more importantly, wider than that, she's been able to raise some incredibly key issues about the need for change. And Apsana has been campaigning and working on housing in particular, the problems that we face in terms of housing, the way in which we can go forward to tackle homelessness and make sure everybody has a decent roof over their heads. So let me pass over to Apsana, and she'll talk us some of the issues she's been dealing with and the future work that we need to undertake. Apsana.
Thank you so much, John, and greetings to everybody who's joined us today. And I just want to sort of start by saying thank you to the World Transformed and Claim the Future for putting on this important event on a very important issue. So, to really begin with, I'd say, we in the labour movement have really sort of long argued that many of the essential things in life should be provided collectively and funded out of general taxation and be free at the point of use for everyone. And, we talk about sort of universal basic services, which was one of the big sort of ideas at the heart of the 2019 manifesto. It didn't just mean talking about protecting the free services that we have, but rather it was a big vision to extend the services we should all have access to. And despite the criticisms reported by the right-wing media during the elections, this never really sounded like a wish list to me, but rather a foundation for a decent life for everybody in the 21st century. And, yet years of neoliberal governments have drained so much hope and belief out of politics. And, people far too often are told that they only deserve to have the most basic of basic services, and some not even this. So I think it's just really important to take a moment to sort of acknowledge the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, John, and Diane Abbott for their level of ambition and, really for saying to people, you deserve better than what you're getting at the moment. And as John has said, today I've been asked to sort of address housing, and my constituency, Poplar and Limehouse, has one of the highest average rents in London, while at the same time having some of the highest rates of poverty in the entire country. And it's a toxic combination, that, which means those on low incomes face an increased risk of homelessness. To put it simply, we just don't have enough social housing. Instead, we have, emboldened landlords and greedy developers who are socially cleansing our city and a housing system that is essentially broken. And the coronavirus crisis, of course, has made that situation much worse. As such, we've been sort of campaigning for rent freezes and writing off arrears in addition to protection from evictions. And now that the limited sort of measures from the government have been pushed into to taking what the government have been pushed into sort of taking are all timed to expire within weeks of one another. And of course, many are now warning of new homelessness crisis to be unleashed just before the winter. I've been working with the Labour Homelessness Campaign, and I've been calling for immediate action to prevent mass homelessness and the destitution of those who have been housed in emergency accommodation during the pandemic. Some hotels that have been housing people experiencing homelessness have already closed, and street homelessness numbers are growing as some become sort of newly homeless as well. And, without assurances that local authorities have a duty and funding to provide long-term accommodation to all rough sleepers, there are fears that homelessness numbers could spike. And, we've had decades of racist sort of dehumanizing policies that deny migrants basic rights. We're seeing how the hostile environment has resulted in many migrants in particular being left destitute and at greater risk of infection. So, homelessness and migrant rights organisations as a result are continuing to warn at the lack of clarity on the disgraceful, inhumane, no recourse to public fund rules as well. Now we know that coronavirus cases are rising. Vast swathes of the country are set to be, under local lockdown. Not least any rise in evictions, forcing people to go into overcrowded accommodation or homelessness could significantly contribute to an increased risk of COVID-19 infection. So, housing really has to be enshrined as a human right rather than be treated as a commodity or an investment. And one of the things that we're sort of thinking about and I wanted to sort of talk about was the West Free generic debacle and how it's sort of further evidence that this government is more interested in serving billionaires rather than the interests of local people. just to give you an example, tax haven using Northern and Shell, they have an ongoing clash with Tower Hamlets Council, and that's really shown that the system isn't fit for purpose and that we need transparency and accountability regarding planning processes. My local council, Tower Hamlets Council's demand of 36% of affordable housing as compared to the 21% currently on offer on that scheme doesn't actually seem like a very good deal in the first place, to be honest, especially when we consider that affordable doesn't really mean affordable. And I sort of wonder, why is it that discourse around housing in the mainstream is so blinkered and uninspiring? Why is it that authorities have to beg the private sector for crumbs, and that for every affordable home, which I've said is not actually affordable, we have to have at least 2 or more luxury flats that no one locally could even begin to fantasize about affording? And why do we let companies do their own viability assessments? And that it's so accepted that in some cases 20% profit margins must be maintained. So I can't actually understand why any development is actually going ahead locally that has even one luxury property, if I'm being honest, given Tower Hamlets' housing crisis, and our borough is so overcrowded and so densely populated. And that, obviously in places increase a huge amount of pressure on services. So therefore, in the long run, we really need ambitious targets for social housing, council house building, requisitioning empty houses by compulsory purchase orders, I think, as well, and of course rent controls as well to protect private renters all the time. And apologies for the cliche, but we really need to imagine again, and that's really what we need to do when it comes to housing. I want to sort of talk about the housing in relation to BAME communities as well in the context of the pandemic. 3 years after Grenfell, a complete tragedy and catastrophe which exposed how little Black Lives Matter to the British establishment, there are still 300 high-rise residential and publicly owned buildings with unsafe cladding, including in Tower Hamlets. And this summer, Public Health England did an investigation into the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on certain groups, and that really revealed that factors such as racism and social inequality may have contributed to increased risks of BAME communities catching and dying from the virus, including the alarming statistic that Bangladeshi people face around twice the risk of death. So, it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that months later statistics published by the government indicated that households with the highest rates of overcrowding were from a Bangladeshi background at 24%. And workers of Bangladeshi heritage have the lowest median hourly pay of any ethnic group, and they're overrepresented in the most deprived neighborhoods in England, the very areas really where deaths from COVID-19 occur at a double rate in more affluent areas. So my constituency is one of the most diverse in the country, where around 2/3 of the population are from ethnic minority backgrounds, with a large Bangladeshi population, and it is one of the most deprived, and now we have suffered a huge percentage of excess deaths due to COVID-19. And households with low income are more likely to be overcrowded or have damp problems than higher income households, because they can't afford to move to a larger house or to fix damp problems, and that's really relevant because when we know that COVID-19 attacks the respiratory system, which can be compromised due to chronic exposure to damp conditions, and the evidence points towards an increase in the mortality rate resulting from ethnic minority people living in more densely populated, more polluted, and more deprived areas, including among key workers. So since it's become sort of clear that the probability of being infected by COVID-19 is likely to be higher in close contact settings, and that social distancing and self-isolation rules will be much more difficult to uphold in overcrowded households. It really should have been clear to anyone who really wanted to know, if you really wanted to know for some time now, that these systemic sort of economic inequalities mean that ethnic minority communities are at higher risk of being in poverty and are so particularly disadvantaged by the health crisis we are enduring. So, structural racism really needs to be addressed, and we need answers as to why BAME people are always forced to get the smallest slice of the cake, as it were. And, we need to know why services for us are the first to be cut and why our lives right now are not being protected. Why is housing and houses for families in particular not being built for the wonderfully diverse population that already lives in our area? So moving on now, in the meantime, where we stand now, we really can't leave tenants to rely on the charity and goodwill of their landlords. The lockdown has empowered a new wave of tenant action, often sort of effectively using Zoom, online forums and social media to really garner that support for their demands. But whether it's sort of fundraising or eviction resistance, collective rent negotiation or rent strikes and occupations, these are not new ideas or tactics. In East London, for example, we know that nothing's going to be given to us on a plate, and we've had to fight hard and struggle for everything. And I just sort of want to touch upon, back in sort of the 1970s and onwards, in particular, housing was a really key issue faced by the Bengali community locally here, and racial discrimination existed in housing allocations, in homelessness, and there was a real lack of support from statutory authorities, which really forced people to seek alternatives. The community here really faced sort of constant threats to their homes from city developers, and families in particular endured sort of appalling conditions in cramped, unsanitary buildings, which often lacked sort of basic amenities. And Bangladeshi people in particular, really increasingly began to squat in houses and organize themselves, and that that really makes me sort of think about that time and where we are now. By the late 80s, there were at least sort of 5 Bangladeshi community-based housing cooperatives in Tower Hamlets, and that just to kind of think what that organizing was able to sort of achieve. And I just want to end on the note that it's in this tradition and many others like it that we really need to mobilize a movement from bottom up that can defend what we have won so far and demand even more. Thank you.
Wow. Look, the discussion today is about what are the basic essentials of the sort of society that we want to create and what we need. Apsana, you've set a heck of an agenda there. Nikki, what's the word for wonderful? What's the sign for wonderful? It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. Can I just raise one thing you put in there as well, which I think you've raised before, and I think it's absolutely critical. We do need to send a message out to the rest of the Labour Party in particular, but our movement more widely. You related housing to racial inequality, and I'm so pleased you did that. But no recourse to public funds. You raise that as well. Let us just make it clear from our perspective to the rest of the movement, we expect Labour to commit itself to scrapping, banning this whole thing of no recourse to public funds. It's a basic humanitarian demand. And I think we've got to make sure that the Labour Party stands proud on that issue that you've raised. And I know you've raised it consistently, so I'm grateful for that. Let's move on. Our next speaker, again, is one of our new members of Parliament. It's just impressive. If people saw him this week at Prime Minister's questions, he raised directly the issue he wants to talk about with Boris Johnson, which is about food poverty and food security. It's Ian Byrne. Ian has been working on this issue. He's been working on it in a whole range of ways. One is through Fans for Food Banks with his own local football club. I won't mention the football club that we both support, but there you are. I won't mention their name, the fact that they won the Premiership. Never mind, we won't go into that. But also, he's been raising the issue about the continuation of support food strategy, etc. Not just during the pandemic, but in the long term. And if we're going to talk about the basic essentials of what a decent society, a social society would look like, food and healthy food and the supply of healthy food has got to be key. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that introduction. And yeah, it's Liverpool, isn't it? Thanks very much for the World Transform for giving me this opportunity to speak today. I'm quite humbled to be on this platform with so many fantastic comrades, and what a brilliant contribution by Oksana, and fully agree with everything that she just said. Absolutely magnificent opening. So follow that. It might be a little bit difficult. But I want to just talk about, as John said, food insecurity, and maybe what we can do as a movement, as the left, to look at what the solutions are post-COVID. So I'll bring up a few things, and I'm sure there'll be lots to discuss, but I'll crack on if you don't mind. So I just want to read something which Philip Alston wrote in 2017 when he done the report on what was actually happening within this country. The bottom line is that much of the glue that has held together British society since the Second World War has been deliberately removed and replaced with a harsh and uncaring ethos, pursued more as an ideological than an economic agenda. And I think I can't sum up as good as that, how he done that in such in short paragraph. He absolutely nailed it, what was actually happening in this country. And we are living through a humanitarian crisis which has affected millions of our citizens every day. But it's a crisis of food poverty born out of the political choices and systemic failures which has been created over the last 4 decades. And I feel now, during COVID, we're at a tipping point with that for so many in our communities who are facing food insecurity built up over the last 10 years. But as I say, during the COVID period, what we're seeing now is millions more thrown into what other millions have faced over the last 10 years. So just to back that up, we've got the Trust and Trust reporting an 81% increase for emergency food parcels this over this period of COVID from the same time last year. There's 122% rise in food parcels given out to children over the last 12 months compared to last year. I mean, these are absolutely damning because we've seen the rise of food poverty since 2010. The correlation between what the Office of Budget Responsibility reports, which was a 36 billion cut to social security, has led to the explosion of food banks, of food insecurity. And what we've seen is the rise of food banks from hundreds in 2010 to thousands in 2020. And it's absolutely shameful. And what disgusted me yesterday, to be honest, was David Cameron. I think he's got a book coming out, and he's reporting that he worked in his local food bank in Chipping Norton during the COVID period, and I don't know what he was expecting us to do, because this is the architect of austerity, and what he actually implemented is what I'm going to talk about today, and we've seen the rise from 2010 to 2020. But the question I want to pose to people watching now is, how can we reverse this shameful growth? As socialists, how can we effectively change our class and our country so desperately succeed? It requires, post-COVID, to shape a society that can reverse the damage so future generations do not face the same callous environment that's been created since 2010. So now I've got the opportunity in Parliament to speak about these issues. I had the opportunity on Wednesday, my first Prime Minister's questions, and I asked Johnson 2 questions on 2 issues which I feel as though are extremely important into linking into this debate. I asked them about the local welfare assistance, which shamefully has been absolutely decimated. And we've got research by the Children's Society, which says there's been an 86% cut since 2010 in local welfare assistance. It was £250 million, and in 2019 there was £41 million spent on it. Now just think about that, because that fund is set up specifically to help the most vulnerable in society that have fallen through the nets, and it's targeted by councils extremely effectively to help people out who needed the help most absolutely decimated by this government. Shamefully, in Liverpool, we've got Councillor Jane Corbett, who's our Assistant Mayor for tackling fairness and tackling poverty and fighting for fairness. And she's one of my colleagues in Everton. I'm still a councillor in Everton, and she's absolutely magnificent in what she does. And she outlines it far better than I can. The government's long-term and systematic dismantling of council funding, particularly in the most disadvantaged areas of the country, severely hindered local authorities' abilities to respond to household in desperate need of support. So once again, we're seeing this pernicious policy making targeting the most vulnerable in society. So that's why he brought this up at Prime Minister's questions, working with the fantastic organisations like the Children's Society, CPAG, Joseph Brown, Chile Russell Trust, calling for the reinstallation of the 250 million now that has been cut away post-COVID, so that safety net is there. But I want to touch on something which maybe could have stopped that cut happening, which is a change in law, which is bringing in the right to food into legislation. And at PMQs, I asked Johnson to sit down, work with me and other agencies and look at how we can implement the right to food into law. We also sit on the EFRA committee. We asked, could we have that put into the report? Because we've got Henry Dimbleby's looking at a national food plan. They agreed, it's gone into the report as an ask for something to be explored with the right for food. And people are still probably thinking what the right for food, you know, what's he talking about? Well, as John mentioned at the start, the 2019 manifesto was a thing of beauty in my eyes, and I included a commitment for the right to food as a commitment to end the scandal of food hunger and food banks. So the right to food would, if it's enshrined into law, it would give clear obligations, create mechanisms to set positive targets and monitor progress, introduce avenues to make governments, agencies actually accountable for their actions, so their policies, and if they violated them, we could then challenge the government. So we'd ensure that the government, whoever was in charge, whatever party was in government at the time, to refrain from policies that would violate the right, which would then enhance the ability to secure the right to food for all our citizens across the country. So many of the policies which have been implemented by the coalition and the Tories would have been able to be challenged. So the 5-week wait for universal credit would have been allowed to be challenged. The cut to welfare assistance fund that was just outlined would have been able to be challenged. So this, for me, is fundamental to where we need to go. We could use the right to food as a foundation to rebuild the welfare safety net in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. And that, for me, is something which we should all aspire to. We must, as a left, firmly believe this. We must be using every lever to achieve this, but it won't happen overnight. So meanwhile, what can we do in the immediate here and now with regards how we create something which can create more food security for our class and our communities? John touched on it before. I think the solidarity shown during the COVID epidemic has been heartwarming. It's been one of the positives to come out of this horrible period in our history. And I think we can draw real strength from what we've actually achieved as communities over this period by coming together, and obviously completely at odds with the ideology of Thatcher, you know, with her famous quote on society, at odds with how Philip Alston how he's seen the society going and talking about, you know, an uncaring ethos. Well, I think many communities across the country during COVID have actually rejected that ethos, rejected that ideology and come together. And it's an opportunity. Here in Liverpool, as a community, we reacted far quicker. We couldn't make the governments. So, you know, on the ground, we acted extremely quickly to put systems in place which would make sure that the people who didn't have the ability to get food, whether they were shielded through food poverty, we made sure that they were targeted. So what we did, I am going to speak about Transport Food Banks because it's an organisation dating me up. We created it in 2015. It's grown shamefully grown, if I'm honest, to where we are now. But what we did during the COVID, start of the COVID pandemic, we realised that our operation couldn't carry on as it was, because we collect through the football matches. The football matches have been halted. So what we did is we pulled together a consortium of groups in February, March, of community groups, sporting institutions, the city council, to come together and create a hub which would then create food parcels for thousands of people across the city during the pandemic. But the model was created using solidarity and not charity, and we're keen to emphasise that. Solidarity, not charity. So we bought local businesses and we created a nutritious food package which went, as I said, right across the city. And that collaboration, which is the ethos of Transformative Food Banks, is something which we've grafted during the COVID into a community response, and it's something to say we're extremely proud of that we've done in Liverpool. And as I say, we couldn't wait around for the government. So moving on from that sort of like initial coming together in the crisis, how can we use that to build something post-COVID for our communities? And I think I've been working on this with a number of agencies, and we have no way we got any we can't say we've got a solution, but we've got ideas which so we can build solutions. So the lack of affordable, nutritious and healthy food has a direct and devastating impact on so many across our communities, health and well-being, and people with limited resources, obviously linked against the poverty issue, linked against government policy, find it difficult to access food, which is healthy and nutritious, and sometimes we fall into what's affordable, which is processed food. So people in deprived areas are more likely to become obese, suffer with diet-related illnesses. I think there's a prevalence of excess weight 11% higher in less affluent communities than more affluent communities. So there's a huge health inequality. So how can we tackle that and empower communities to tackle that, and not wait for the governments, not wait for any governments to come up with solutions? What can we do from the grassroots? Ideas from our communities which can aid our communities. And I think this is something which I'm really, really interested in developing and working with groups across the country. So locally developed community food plans, it improve community-based local food systems, supply vital food education, and aid more nutritious food into our communities. And plans would encompass local food markets, community gardens, community shops, kitchens, allotment management, educate, train local people on household food management, healthy diets, food cultivation skills. And it's something which we're extremely eager to build on, because we do think this is the future. Local food networks have been around for a long time. There's thousands of small-scale localised food initiatives across the country doing absolutely magnificent jobs. But what potential they can give us by bringing it together under an umbrella. I mean, I firmly believe the Labour Party should be tapped into this on the grassroots level and building in communities. So in my constituency in West Derby at the moment, detailed works going on at the moment. We want to support local food network, link allotments, schools, food banks, food pantries, community enterprises, community kitchens, together in a coordinated, holistic approach, providing education, empowering people to engagement, which is key, and offering a solution and access to food with dignity and humanity. By encouraging this development and growth of this network, they provide the potential for local people to move from being passive consumers to being active participants in their own food, local food economics. And this is absolutely crucial. We want the right to food to embody this shift from charity to solidarity, from donations to collaborations, and empowering communities. Building solidarity is a fundamental part of this process and should be something which we, as a left movement, encourage, grow and work on bringing together. And, you know, I think we should invest in local people. But what an opportunity we've got. You know, we've got over 500,000 members in the Labour Party at the moment. We've got many, many other left socialist networks out there. And I think this is a fundamental right, because we're going to face over the next 3 to 6 months with potentially the end of furlough, a second spike. We're just going to face more and more issues. And there's nothing more important than putting food on the table for people in our communities. And I think by bringing people together under the umbrella of mutual aid, socialist movements, it's what I feel so passionately that we've got to do. And the local developed community food plan for me are something which is the embodiment of socialist values and something we should build on in all our communities. And what is certain that if we'd had this in place and the 2000 manifesto was going to build on this, it was going to build on local food networks, we would have been in a far better place to face the challenges of COVID-19. And the implementation of these two small parts of the solution, which I spoke about today, would roll back the incessant growth of food insecurity under the Tory government. And as a nation, we cannot continue to fail millions of people with life expectancy rates, differences of 10 years in the same city, Kensington and Liverpool to Kensington and London, over 10 years life expectancy differences. And we simply need more levelling up. We need more equality. And I feel as though what I've just outlined there could actually help to move us in the right direction, because our children are being raised with parents in survival mode at the moment due to food poverty. And for me, the only radical socialist policies offers the answers to fix our broken society. And I'll finish on that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ian. Sam, how do you sign brilliant? That's it. Good. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, Ian. Absolutely terrific. And there's detailed work that Ian has done. He's willing to share with comrades so that they can start looking at what they do locally as well. Thanks, Ian. Actually, my great aunt was deaf, and my dad used to sign, but they always used to say he signed in a Scouse accent. Bizarre. Anyway, our next speaker. Look, you'll know our next speaker, Nadia Whittam. Nadia this week, I don't know whether people saw it, but it was just brilliant. Nadia Whittam, who went back to work as a carer during the pandemic, no wages, just did app commitment, then exposed the lack of PPE, got hammered by the Tories, and the press really tried to destroy her. And this week, it was proven she was exactly right. She made the call and she did it courageously. It was interesting. I didn't hear any apologies from those Tory MPs that were attacking her. I tell you, she's a heroine, and she's really, another one of the new MPs have made her mark. She wants to talk about the crisis in social care and where we go from here. Nadia.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to TWT and to Claim the Future, to Apsana and Ian, who both inspire me, and it's going to be a difficult act to follow speaking after them, and particularly to John for putting on this series. I'm looking forward to you, John, being like the Tony Benn of the backbenchers of our times. I was a care worker before I was elected, and I returned to care work during the pandemic because I knew how much social care had already been strained by 10 years of cuts to the tune of 7.7 billion since 2010. And I wanted to help my former colleagues as a practical act of solidarity, because I knew that the burden of COVID would not just be falling on the social care sector, but would be falling on low paid, predominantly women, also disproportionately migrant and women of colour workers. As John said, and we all saw it in the news, so I don't need to repeat that, but I spoke out about the lack of PPE, and because I was on a 0 hours contract, as I was when I worked previously as a care worker, I could be effectively sacked at the drop of a hat. Now, if this can happen to an MP, somebody with the financial privilege and the platform that I have, imagine the level of insecurity, precariousness, and intimidation that all care workers experience on a daily basis. So after that, I invited care workers from across the country to contact me. And unsurprisingly, my experience wasn't a one-off. It was, in fact, alarmingly prevalent across the care sector. People contacted me from the Northwest to Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, the South Coast. And they all told me about their experiences of a lack of PPE, testing, safety that they faced on the front line during the pandemic, and how poorly they felt treated, both by their employer, but also by the government. So I held a Zoom call for these whistleblowers, one that protected their anonymity. And that was a really emotional and profound moment for me. It was a really profound moment of solidarity, I think, for all of us. And now as a group, we're working together with trade unions and discussing our next steps as a campaign. Because I strongly and passionately believe that we have to use this moment, we've got to galvanise it to improve the situation in social care for workers, for users, and recognising that this is a moment that has brought social workers, carers, to the forefront of public consciousness. Because we can never forget that the rights of care workers and the functionality of the care sector is all at the same time a feminist issue, it's a social justice issue, a workers' issue, and it's a migrants' rights issue. And I think it's up to us to speak out on behalf of the thousands of workers who are less able to do so for themselves for fear of their livelihoods and losing their already very insecure employment, but also, of course, to amplify the voices of those who are. Looking back at the last few months, it's clear to me, as it will be to all of you, that there needs to be a reckoning for the way that this workforce and the people who depend on care have been so tragically and chronically let down by this government during the pandemic. And when we're looking at rebuilding after COVID, of course, we've got to radically restructure the economy, but we can't be returning back to normal, because normal was broken for so many people. We need to transform the society that we live in and to create the world that we should have always had, because this problem of vast poverty and inequality is not a new one. It's just one that's been exacerbated during COVID. So when the Prime Minister talks about building back better, it's really jarring that his vision completely excludes investment in care altogether. When I've got the statistics here, investment in the care sector is 8 times less carbon intensive than the average of all industries. It would produce 30% less greenhouse gas emissions than construction and almost 3 times as many jobs, about 2 million jobs, whilst at the same time reducing the gender employment gap. That's research from the Women's Budget Group that they've made available to the government, but the government just hasn't listened. I want to move on by talking about what the future of social care should look like. COVID has obviously shown that it's not fit for purpose and why we need a resilient care sector. I've already said that 7.7 billion has been cut from social care since 2010. And what we've got is a privatised, fragmented, very, very low union density sector. It's short-termist, defined by competitive tendering processes where public money is used to subsidise private profit. But this crisis, this pandemic, I think also provides an exciting opportunity for us to reimagine what social care looks like, not as something that is separate from the rest of society that happens over there to other people who aren't like us, and not something that views people as helpless or inherently vulnerable, but as people who have been marginalised by the capitalist system that we live under, and people who should have agency. So I want to see a social care policy written by workers, users of social care, wider society, a social care policy that maximises people's autonomy. And I think that's we often talk about autonomy as being something that only the private sector can be good at. Actually, the opposite is the case. And we need to scrap. I think the private sector has absolutely no place in social care. We need to scrap top-down private services, and for that matter, not replace it with top-down state services. Scrap outsourcing and embrace things like co-ops, like public social partnerships, where the local state collaborates with not-for-profit organisations. And that brings me to an important point, which is that this isn't just a question of funding, it's also about alternative democratic models of ownership that give people and communities power, essentially a model that means workers' control and users' control. And I'm really looking forward and committed to working with people in this call, to looking for ways in Parliament that we can raise the economic and social benefits of a post-COVID recovery that centres on care. And even more importantly than that, amplifying all of the movements outside Parliament and workers who are demanding this. Thanks, everyone.
Great, Nadia. Sam, what's the expression for terrific? That's it for me. That's it for me. Yeah. Nadia, I don't want to be the Tony Benn on the backbenchers. Actually, the person who reminds me most of Tony Benn is Jeremy, and I think that's the role he'll play, inspiring and principled, and actually also with a detailed, comprehensive knowledge of a lot of the policy areas that we deal with. I think that's Jeremy's role, particularly on foreign policy. I want to be the Bill Shankly of the left, bring the team together and remember, Bill always won. Anyway, look, we've got about 10 minutes. Okay. There's a couple of questions. Well, there's more than that. There's a lot of questions. Let me just pick a few. Sorry, Charlie, who's doing the tech work and not letting you know sooner. Look, I'm going to fire these questions at different people. Okay. Sylvia came in for you, Ian, and said, can I ask you to consider food insecurity in rural areas? She's writing about it. And John Solway added to that. I think this is an interesting question. You've referred to it a bit, Ian. John Solway said, do food banks actually underwrite systemic food inequality rather than challenging it? That's to Ian. Let me just go on. I'll bring everyone in if I can. In terms of Nadia, there's a good question from Ian Crompton. What role do you see as service users having in the design and control of social care services? For example, a cooperative radical democratic co-production model. That's a bit of a mouthful for me as well. And then Apsana, actually was a good one here. Adrian Litvinov said, we may be witnessing the hollowing out of town centres. Does this raise an opportunity for making them more livable, more accessible to lower income groups for living in and workplaces too? Okay, we've got 10 minutes, so really we've got about a couple of minutes on each of those questions to responses. Can I bring Ian in first on the food bank questions?
Yeah, I'm certainly happy to work with anyone regarding rural poverty, John. So I forget the lady's name. She wants to get in touch. We'd be delighted to have a chat with her. Oh, Sylvia. Yeah, I'd be delighted to learn more about that and work alongside her. With regard to underwriting food inequality, absolutely, we took a little bit of stick when we set up fan-supporting food banks, and rightly so, because people thought it would have done that. But for me, the adage me and Dave used was the miners' strike in '84 when he was starving our class out of existence, and we feel as though it was exactly the same. So it was either do something about it, use this as a stick and plaster and try and build a solidarity, collaboration in education, then to move forward and empower local communities. Hopefully, as I outlined, we're on the cusp of doing something to address this situation. So I think it had to be done. And what we do now is we move on to the next evolutionary stage, which is empowering communities to take control of their own food security, which is something I look forward to doing, John.
Thanks, Ian. Apsana, could you come in on this question about the potential for the revamping of town centres so that people can live in them and how they can make them more, I suppose, livable overall? There's an opportunity there, isn't there?
I think in some ways there are, and I think we have to acknowledge in a lot of ways how I think the current economic landscape, has posed so many challenges, and we are going to see lots of sort of, I suppose, independent businesses and the local economy in some ways being squeezed as a result of the pandemic. But I do think there are definitely, that flip side is quite important to actually look at how we can, broaden out from that. And I think there are opportunities, and I think particularly in terms of sort of more small to medium sort of retailers and in the town centres, protecting that and thinking about how they're supporting their workforce. And I think we've seen sort of really big sort of collapses of some big businesses and big retailers over the years, and we know through the last decade as well, we've seen the sort of really big sort of victims of recessions. But I think this is an opportunity to really actually understand what our local towns and communities actually mean, and ensuring that sort of those redundancies and workers are not sort of left to foot the bill.
Thanks, Apsana. Can I quickly bring Nadia in? Role of service users in the design of the future of care services and this issue of co-production, cooperation. Where are you at on this, Nadia?
Ian, this is a typical you question. Ian lives around the corner from me and we often have this conversation. It's a very good question. I think I'd like to see service users working with workers and also the wider community, because I think that social care services shouldn't be something that are shot away somewhere else, to write what they need, because they're the experts in social care as people who rely on it and engage with it. I think, a cooperative, democratic co-production model is a good idea, and I think that that's something that the Labour Party and the Labour movement, trade union, should be facilitating.
Thanks, Nadia. That's great. Look, I think this has been a really interesting session. The reason for bringing it together under the auspices of Claim the Future and the World Transformed is just to demonstrate the sort of optimism that we've got, both in terms of the way in which we can develop, and actually, yes, all of us on the left lead the thinking for our movement for the future. But also, I just also wanted to just make sure people recognize that there's this new generation that's come through in our movement that are now being elected to key positions. And if you look, as I say, the new MPs that have come in the last election in particular, they've just been fantastic. We built upon the previous generation, the Richard Bergens, the Becky Long Baileys, Cat Smith, and others who came in the time before Marshall got over those. And you can see now that within the Parliamentary Labour Party, for the first time in quite a long time, there's some really solid left-wing, very extremely talented people who are articulating the voices of our members now, and I'm confident for the future. But there's a lot of work to be undertaken, and you've heard today sort of detailed work that's being undertaken by those MPs working with the various groups that alongside us within the party and the trade union movement. That's what Claim the Future is all about. I'll just make a couple of plugs. There's a couple of other Claim the Future events this week. On Monday, there's a discussion. We're bringing together a group of, again, radical social thinkers, young radical social thinkers, to talk about the concept of claiming the future, what sort of future we want. Ash Sarkar, Christine Berry, Andrew Fisher. And then on the Tuesday, which is a bit of a surprise, I'm hosting an In Conversation event with Gordon Brown, who's actually last week came out with a program around full employment, which was pretty radical and which has gained a lot of support, which again, we want him to be able to outline that. And I think there's a real potential of building a sizable coalition for that to be endorsed by the Labour Party leadership, of course, but also for us to campaign on right the way across our community and trade union movement. Just a few announcements before I go. And thanks. Remember, lots more events on TWT20. They're filling up very quickly as well. Be sure to register. Make sure you've registered the festival at the worldtransformed.org/register. So the worldtransformed.org/register, and then go to the individual event you'd like to register from the program. And finally, if you've enjoyed this session and would like to help TWT be sustained in their work, it's important and critical work. And it isn't just at this festival, it's beyond that too. Please do consider them and it'll be on the website, but it's https://theworldtransformed.org/support/. Okay. I'm hopeless at reading these things out, but they'll all be up on the chat, and also Google the World Transformed. Give us your support. I'd like to thank Nikki and Sam. Look, there's campaigning now to be done around the BSL and signers to support signers in the future. We need to get behind that campaign because it's an essential service. Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, Sam. You're absolutely wonderful. Thanks for everyone attending today. Charlie and all the others, and all have given us the technical support today. I'm really, really grateful. And please do enjoy the rest of TWT and come along to our joint meetings with Claim the Future. Solidarity.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.